My name is Thomas Reed. I'm 37 years old, and until recently, I worked as a lighthouse keeper on a rocky stretch of coastline most people don't bother naming. If you look it up on a map, it's just a smudge of land off the mainland, surrounded by cold water and warning symbols. No town nearby, no ferry schedule anyone sticks to. Just a lighthouse that still operates because replacing it with automation was deemed too expensive for the risk profile. That phrase shows up a lot in the paperwork. Risk profile. Sounds clean, professional. It doesn't begin to cover what really happens out there. I'm writing this because I made it back, barely, and because the rules I was given weren't superstition or tradition, or some board keeper's attempt to mess with the new guy. They were instructions. And the fog doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. I took the job because I needed quiet. After my divorce, after getting laid off from a port security position, silence felt like medicine. The posting promised isolation, routine maintenance, and one overnight shift every 2 weeks when weather made rotation unsafe. I'd worked offshore before. I knew how to be alone. I didn't ask why the previous keeper left mid-contract. They handed me a key, a binder, and a satellite phone with only 2 program numbers. One went to the Coast Guard operations desk. The other wasn't labeled at all. Just a number. The supervisor, a man who refused to meet my eyes, told me to read the binder before my first solo night. Especially the rules, he said, like he was reminding me to check the oil in a truck. The binder was old. Salt-warped pages. Handwritten notes layered over typed instructions. Some crossed out. Some underlined so hard the paper tore. The first page wasn't a safety checklist or emergency protocol. It was a list titled simply, "When the fog rolls in." Rule 1. If fog appears before sunset, log the time. If it appears after sunset, do not log it at all. Rule 2. When visibility drops below the 3rd marker buoy, extinguish all interior lights except the stairwell. Rule 3. Do not respond to voices outside during fog, regardless of language, familiarity, or perceived distress. I remember laughing quietly when I read that one, alone in the supervisor's office, binder on my knees, thinking it sounded like something from a campfire story. But the man across from me didn't smile. He just said, "You'll understand," and took the binder back to add one more thing in pen. He wrote, "If the foghorn sounds on its own, do not attempt to stop it." My first week passed without incident. Routine checks, cleaning lenses, recording weather patterns. The sea stayed calm, clear, empty. The lighthouse itself was old but solid, stone walls thick enough to mute the wind. There was a rhythm to it that felt comforting. I started sleeping better than I had in months. The fog came on my 8th night. It wasn't on the forecast. The horizon had been clean all afternoon, a sharp line between steel-gray water and pale sky. I was making coffee when I noticed the light outside the window change, like someone had dimmed the world. By the time I stepped out onto the catwalk, the fog was already rolling in low and fast, swallowing the buoys one by one. I checked my watch. Sunset had passed 20 minutes earlier. I remembered Rule 1 and closed the logbook without writing anything. The air changed with the fog. Not colder, not wetter, just heavier. Every sound felt closer, like the fog carried it straight to your ear. I went through the motions automatically, turning off the interior lights until only the stairwell glowed faintly. The beam of the lighthouse continued its slow rotation, cutting uselessly into the white. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, wet, careful. The sound of shoes on stone, pacing the base of the tower. I froze halfway down the stairs, hand gripping the rail, heart pounding so hard it hurt. This wasn't a tourist area. There was no dock close enough for someone to arrive unnoticed, especially in weather like this. Then a voice called out, "Thomas," not shouted, not desperate, just spoken, calmly, like someone standing a few feet away, certain I would answer. Rule 3 pressed itself into my mind so hard it felt physical. Do not respond to voices outside during fog, regardless of familiarity. The voice spoke again, closer this time. "I know you're in there. The light's on." It wasn't my supervisor's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized, but it said my name the way people do when they know you well, like it belonged in their mouth. I held my breath and waited for it to leave. Instead, the foghorn sounded. I hadn't touched the control panel. I hadn't scheduled a warning blast. The deep, mournful sound rolled out over the water, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet. My instincts screamed to shut it off, to fix whatever malfunction was happening. But I remembered the pen-written note in the binder. Do not attempt to stop it. Outside, the footsteps stopped. The voice fell silent. For a long time, nothing else happened. I stood there until my legs shook, listening to the foghorn cry out at steady intervals, feeling like the lighthouse was breathing around me. Eventually, the footsteps returned, slower now, circling. Something scraped against the door at the base of the tower. Fingernails, maybe, or something trying to sound like fingernails. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I followed the rules. The fog didn't lift until morning. When the sun finally broke through, the sea was empty again. No footprints on the rocks. No sign anyone had been there. Just the lighthouse, the water, and the binder waiting on the desk, open to a blank page at the end. I added nothing to it. That was my first night with the fog. It wouldn't be the last. I didn't sleep after that first fog lifted. I tried, lying on the narrow cot with the blanket pulled up to my chest, listening to the lighthouse settle and creak as if nothing unusual had happened. Morning light streamed through the narrow windows, clean and ordinary, and that almost made it worse. Daylight has a way of gaslighting you. It tells you that whatever scared you at night was exaggerated, imagined, a trick of fatigue. But the smell hadn't gone away. The fog left behind a faint metallic scent inside the tower, like wet coins rubbed together. It clung to the stairwell, strongest near the door at the base. I noticed it while doing my morning checks, nose wrinkling as I descended. The door was locked. The bolts were still thrown. Nothing looked disturbed. And yet, when I placed my hand against the wood, it felt colder than the surrounding stone, like it had been pressed against ice for hours. I told myself it was condensation, salt air, old materials, anything but what my instincts were whispering. Around mid-morning, the Coast Guard called in for a routine status check. I almost didn't answer. My throat tightened the moment the satellite phone buzzed, as if some part of me worried the fog had learned how to use it. When I finally picked up, the operator's voice was cheerful, bored. Lighthouse station confirmed operational, I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a pause, papers rustling. Any fog overnight? She asked. I stared at the logbook on the desk, the empty line where a time should have been. Negative, I said. Another pause, longer this time. Copy that, she replied. Weather should stay clear until late evening. Call if you need anything. The line went dead before I could ask the question that had been forming since sunrise. How often does the fog come in unannounced? I spent the afternoon maintaining the lens housing, forcing myself into routine. Every task I completed felt like a small anchor, something solid to hold on to. The sea remained calm. Gulls wheeled overhead. If not for the binder sitting on the desk, its edges curled with age, I might have convinced myself the night before hadn't happened at all. But then I noticed something new written in the margins. I don't remember seeing it earlier. That's what bothers me most. The binder hadn't left my sight since the fog lifted. Yet there it was, cramped handwriting in pencil near the bottom of the rules page. If it knocks, you're already too late. I read it 3 times, my pulse ticking louder with each pass. There was no signature, no date, just that single sentence, pressed so hard into the paper it had left an impression on the page beneath. I told myself it must have been there all along. Stress plays tricks. Fear fills in blanks. That's what rational people think. That's what I thought right up until the fog returned. This time it came early. I was standing on the catwalk, scanning the horizon out of habit, when I saw it creeping low over the water like a living thing. The sun was still above the line, a dull orange disk sinking slowly, and the fog moved against the wind, swallowing the light in defiance of every weather pattern I knew. Rule 1 echoed in my head. If fog appears before sunset, Log the time. My hands shook as I wrote it down. 6:12 p.m. The moment the pen left the page, the fog surged forward, thickening so fast it felt aggressive. The third marker buoy vanished in seconds. Then the second. I didn't wait for the first. I rushed inside and killed the lights, leaving only the stairwell glowing faintly, the tower suddenly feeling much smaller, much more enclosed. That's when I heard the radio crackle. It wasn't on. The old marine radio sat on a shelf near the desk, unplugged unless needed. I stared at it as static hissed softly from the speaker, a low whisper beneath the sound of my own breathing. My first instinct was relief. A radio meant people, boats, something normal. Then the static shifted into rhythm, pattern, 3 short bursts, a pause, 2 long ones. I didn't recognize the signal, but something about it made my skin crawl, like it wasn't meant to be heard by human ears. I took a step closer, then stopped. There wasn't a rule about the radio, but there were rules about responding. The static cleared. "Thomas," a voice said, distorted but unmistakable. "You forgot something." I backed away slowly, heart hammering. "This isn't possible," I whispered, then bit my tongue, horrified at myself for speaking at all. The radio didn't respond. The voice didn't repeat itself. The static returned, louder now, almost irritated. Outside something knocked. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. Just a gentle, deliberate tap against the base of the tower, like someone testing to see if I was listening. The words from the binder slammed into my thoughts. "If it knocks, you're already too late." The foghorn roared to life again, shaking the tower with its mournful call. The knocking stopped immediately. The radio went silent. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, gripping the edge of the desk so hard my fingers ached. Then footsteps began on the stairs. They were inside, slow, heavy, ascending from below, each step placed with careful intent. I stood frozen, staring at the stairwell, the dim light casting long shadows that twisted with every sound. I knew the door was locked. I knew no one could have gotten in. The footsteps climbed anyway. I remembered another rule then, one buried deeper in the binder, written in a different hand. Never go down during fog, even if you hear yourself calling. The steps stopped just below the edge of the light. Something breathed there, wet and patient, as if waiting for an invitation I couldn't give. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I followed the rules. The foghorn kept sounding, and with each blast, the presence on the stairs seemed to pull back, retreating inch by inch, until at last there was nothing but silence. When the fog finally lifted hours later, the radio was dead, unplugged just as it had been before. The stairwell was empty. The door was still locked, but on the inside of the door, carved deep into the wood, were fresh marks. Tallies, carefully counted, and there were more of them than there had been the night before. I spent the next hour sitting on the floor with my back against the wall, knees pulled to my chest, staring at those tallies until my eyes burned. There were 13 of them. I was certain of that. I counted again and again, running my fingers just close enough to feel the grooves without touching them. The wood was splintered inward, not outward, as if whatever carved them had been on my side of the door, pressing into it from inside the tower. That was when I realized something else had changed. The lock was still engaged. The bolts were still thrown, but the door no longer felt like a barrier, felt like a suggestion. I forced myself up and went through the rest of the tower slowly, methodically, checking every room, every corner, every shadow. Nothing was out of place. No footprints, no water, no smell of fog this time. If I hadn't seen the tallies myself, I might have believed the night had passed quietly. I didn't report anything to the Coast Guard. I didn't write anything in the logbook. I was starting to understand that records mattered, and not always in ways that helped you. Around noon, I noticed the sea had gone unnaturally still. No whitecaps, no swell. The water looked flat and dull, like a sheet of metal laid out beneath the sky. Even the gulls were gone. I hadn't seen a single bird since morning. That's when the phone rang. Not the satellite phone, the other one. I hadn't touched it since the day I arrived. It sat mounted to the wall near the desk, old and yellowed, its cord stiff with age. No dial tone, no visible power source. I'd assumed it was decorative, a relic from an era when the lighthouse was manned full-time. It rang anyway. The sound was wrong, too loud for such a small space. Each ring seemed to echo inside my skull. I stood there, staring at it, every instinct screaming not to answer. There wasn't a rule about the phone, but by now I knew better than to assume silence meant safety. The ringing stopped on its own. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath, and turned back toward the window. That's when I saw the fog forming again, far out on the water, coiling low and thick. It was still daylight. Rule 1. Log the time. My hand hovered over the pen. The fog hesitated, as if waiting to see what I would do. I don't know how else to describe it. The moment stretched, brittle and tense. I wrote the time, 2:47 p.m. The fog surged forward instantly, racing toward the lighthouse with frightening speed. Within minutes, the world beyond the glass was nothing but white. I shut down the lights, my movements automatic now, my body remembering what my mind still struggled to accept. Almost immediately, the phone rang again. This time, I picked it up. I don't know why. Curiosity. Fear. The sense that refusing to engage might be just as dangerous as engaging the wrong way. I lifted the receiver slowly, bracing myself. There was no greeting, no voice, just breathing. Slow, deep, close. It sounded like someone standing right behind me, lips pressed to my ear, lungs filling and emptying with deliberate control. I turned, heart hammering, but the room was empty. The breathing continued, unbothered by my movement. "State your purpose," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. I wasn't following a rule. I was improvising, hoping there was some logic to this, some structure I could lean on. The breathing paused. Then a voice spoke, layered and uneven, like several people trying to speak at once through the same mouth. "You keep the light," it said. "We keep the shore." My stomach dropped. "The shore is empty," I replied. "There's nothing out there." A sound like amusement rippled through the line. "There used to be," the voice said, "before the fog learned your name." The line went dead. I set the receiver down with shaking hands, every word echoing in my head. The fog outside pressed against the windows now, so thick it blocked out even the faintest hint of sun. The lighthouse beam swept through it uselessly, the light swallowed whole after a few feet. Something moved out there. Not footsteps this time. Shapes, shadows sliding just beyond visibility, stretching and collapsing as the fog shifted. I could sense them more than see them, a prickling awareness that I was being watched from every angle at once. Then the rules binder slid off the desk. It didn't fall. It slid, straight toward the edge, pages fluttering as it hit the floor. I stared at it, pulse racing, then slowly knelt and picked it up. It was open to a section I hadn't read before, pages stuck together as if they'd been deliberately sealed. I separated them carefully. A new rule had been written. If the fog comes more than twice in one day, do not allow the light to complete a full rotation. I looked up sharply at the lens housing above me, panic blooming in my chest. The lighthouse beam was still turning, steady and automatic. I rushed to the control panel, hands fumbling as I searched for the manual override. I found it just as the beam completed another sweep. The tower shuddered. Outside, something screamed. The sound was raw and furious, tearing through the fog like metal scraping bone. It wasn't a human scream. It wasn't an animal. It carried too much intention, too much anger, like a warning given too late. I cut the rotation. The light froze, a single beam locked in place, stabbing uselessly into the fog. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, collective murmur that vibrated through the stone. The fog pressed closer. I felt it then unmistakably, a sense of offense, of boundaries crossed. The rules weren't just for my safety. They were part of an agreement, and I had just broken it. The moment I stopped the light, the entire lighthouse felt wrong. Not broken, not damaged. Wrong in the way a held breath feels wrong when it goes on too long. The hum of the machinery faded into an uneasy silence, and for the first time since I arrived, the tower no longer felt like it was working with me. Felt like it was waiting. I stood at the control panel, fingers hovering uselessly over switches I was suddenly afraid to touch. Outside, the fog churned, thick and restless, pressing against the glass as if it were testing for weaknesses. The collective murmur I'd heard after the scream hadn't stopped. It had lowered, settling into a constant vibration that resonated through the stone floor and into my bones. Then came the footsteps again. Not climbing, not circling, running. They moved fast, pounding around the base of the tower in erratic bursts, overlapping and chaotic, like several bodies moving in different directions at once. I could hear them slipping on wet rock, colliding, recovering instantly. Whatever was out there didn't need light to navigate. My eyes drifted back to the binder lying open on the desk. The page with the new rule was still there, ink dark and fresh, as if it had been written moments ago. Below it, another line was forming slowly, the letters appearing one by one like a wound opening in paper. If you stop the light, you must choose what it shows next. My stomach tightened. Choose, I whispered, the word tasting bitter. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know how to choose. The lighthouse had always run on its own, following mechanical paths set decades ago. Choice had never been part of the job. The running footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. Heavy, expectant. A shape emerged in the fog directly ahead of the frozen beam. At first, it was just a darker smear against the white. Then it sharpened, resolving into something tall and thin, its outline flickering as if struggling to stay solid. It stood just far enough away that the light barely touched it, illuminating fragments without revealing the whole. An arm, too long, a shoulder bent at the wrong angle, a head tilted slightly as if listening. I couldn't see its face, but I knew, with bone-deep certainty, that it was looking straight at me. The binder trembled in my hands as another memory surfaced, one I hadn't paid much attention to before. A paragraph buried between maintenance notes and emergency contacts, written in small, cramped print. The light does not protect. It reveals. Use it carefully. I swallowed hard and reached for the control lever. My hand shook as I nudged the beam to the left. The light slid across the fog, and the shape reacted instantly, recoiling as if burned. A sound like wet fabric tearing echoed through the air, followed by a hiss that made my teeth ache. Encouraged, I moved the beam again, sweeping it slowly, deliberately, across the shoreline. The fog parted where the light touched it, thinning just enough for me to see what lay beyond. The shore wasn't empty. Figures stood clustered along the rocks, dozens of them, their forms half-formed and wrong, like reflections that didn't quite match the bodies they belonged to. Some were tall, some were hunched. A few crawled low to the ground, limbs bending in impossible directions. They all faced the lighthouse, heads tilted in unison. As the light passed over them, they reacted differently. Some shrank back, retreating into the fog with low, resentful sounds. Others reached toward the beam, hands stretching long and thin, fingers splitting and reforming as if the light was pulling them apart. One of them stepped forward. It looked more human than the rest. Taller, broader, standing upright on two legs. Its clothes hung in tatters, the suggestion of a coat, boots, something that might once have been a uniform. The light caught its face, and my breath hitched. It was my face. Not exactly. The features were wrong, stretched, the eyes too wide, the mouth pulled into an expression that hovered between a smile and a snarl. But there was no mistaking the resemblance. It raised a hand in a mock wave, mirroring the way I'd waved to the mainland the day I arrived. A pressure built behind my eyes, sharp and dizzying. "That's not me," I whispered, though the words felt weak even to my own ears. The thing tilted its head, then spoke, its voice carrying easily through the fog. "You keep the light," it said. "We keep the rest." I remembered that line from the phone call, the way it had been framed as a balance, an arrangement. My doppelganger took another step forward, the fog swirling around its legs like eager hands. "You broke the pattern," it continued. Now you have to fix it. How? My voice cracked despite my efforts to stay calm. It smiled wider, teeth too numerous, too sharp. By choosing, it said. By showing them. The others stirred at that, a low chorus of anticipation rippling through the fog. The binder in my hands grew heavier, as if absorbing the weight of the moment. Another line appeared beneath the rule, the ink bleeding into the paper. Never show the fog what you are not prepared to lose. My gaze flicked from the page to the beam, then to the figures on the shore. Understanding dawned slowly, sickeningly. The light wasn't a weapon. It was a spotlight, and whatever I chose to reveal next, the fog would take. My hands were slick with sweat as I stood there, the beam of the lighthouse frozen in place, illuminating that thing wearing my face. Every instinct told me to turn the light away, to hide it, to undo whatever mistake I'd made by stopping the rotation. But the rule burned in my mind, sharp and unforgiving. Never show the fog what you are not prepared to lose. The implication settled heavily in my chest. This wasn't about pointing the light at them. It was about pointing it at me. You already have me, I said, forcing the words out. You don't need anything else. The thing smiled, and when it did, its skin pulled too tight, as if stretched over something that didn't quite fit. Not all of you, it replied. Not yet. Behind it, the others shifted closer, their forms rippling with anticipation. The fog thickened around their legs, crawling upward like it was trying to claim them, bind them together. I realized then that the light wasn't keeping them at bay. It was holding them in place, pinning them to the shore like insects under glass. The binder slipped from my grasp and thudded onto the floor, falling open to a page near the back. I hadn't turned to it. I hadn't even touched it. The page was already marked, a block of text written in the same cramped hand as the earlier rules. When the fog demands a showing, you may offer memory, time, or self. Choose carefully. You cannot offer the same thing twice. My vision blurred. Memory, time, self. None of those sounded abstract. They sounded like pieces of a person, carved away one by one until there was nothing left. I thought of my life before the lighthouse, the divorce, the job I'd lost, the quiet I'd been so desperate for. How much of myself had I already given up just to get here? The thing with my face took another step forward, and the light followed it automatically, as if the lighthouse itself was leaning toward the choice. Its eyes gleamed with something like hunger. Show us, it said softly. I closed my eyes. I thought of my father, teaching me how to tie a proper knot on a dock that smelled of salt and diesel. I thought of my mother's laugh, sharp and sudden, the way it startled you into smiling. I thought of the first time I'd seen the sea at night, endless and dark, and felt small in a way that was comforting instead of terrifying. I choose memory, I whispered. The air inside the tower shifted. The light flared, bright and painful, and I cried out as something tore loose inside my head. It wasn't a physical pain, not exactly. It was the sensation of something being pulled away, leaving behind a hollow ache. Images poured out of me, spilling into the beam like smoke caught in sunlight. I saw my childhood dock, my parents' faces, moments I hadn't thought about in years, all projected outward, exposed and vulnerable. The figures on the shore reacted instantly, their forms stretching and warping as they reached for the memories, absorbing them greedily. The thing with my face threw its head back and laughed, the sound echoing horribly across the water. Yes, it said. Like that. The fog surged, wrapping around the beam, carrying the stolen moments away. One by one, the images faded, dissolving into nothing. When the light dimmed, I opened my eyes and staggered, gripping the console to keep from falling. I knew something was wrong immediately. I couldn't remember my mother's face. Panic flared hot and sharp. I tried to picture her, to force the image into focus, but all I got was a blank space where her features should have been. I remembered facts, that she existed, that she'd laughed a certain way, but the image itself was gone, erased cleanly, as if it had never belonged to me. The thing with my face stepped back, satisfied. The others retreated slightly, their agitation settling into something like contentment. The fog thinned at the edges, the pressure easing just enough for me to breathe. "1," it said, holding up a finger. "2 remain." The words hit me harder than any blow. This wasn't a one-time exchange. It was a process, a sequence that had to be completed. The light began to rotate on its own again, slowly at first, then settling into its familiar rhythm. The lighthouse seemed to relax, the machinery humming as if relieved. The fog responded, pulling back from the windows, the shore dissolving into white once more. Within minutes, the world was empty again. I sank to the floor, shaking, my mind reeling as I tested my thoughts, my memories, cataloging what was still there and what wasn't. Some things remained intact. Others felt thin, frayed at the edges, like pages torn from a book. Outside, the foghorn sounded once, long and low. Not a warning, a confirmation. I stayed like that until the fog finally lifted for the third time that day, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than before. The sea returned to its dull calm. The sky darkened toward evening. I knew with terrible certainty that night wasn't over yet, and I had only paid the first price. Night settled in slowly, as if the world itself was reluctant to finish the day. The sky darkened in uneven bands, the last traces of color draining away until only gray remained. I sat at the desk, staring at the logbook without really seeing it, my head buzzing with a dull, persistent ache where something important used to be. I kept testing my memories, prodding them gently, afraid that pushing too hard would make more of them crumble. I remembered my name, my age, how to do my job. I remembered taking this assignment, remembered stepping onto the boat that brought me here. But when I tried to think of why the sea had once felt comforting, or whose hand I'd held the first time I watched a storm roll in, my mind slipped like it was trying to grip wet stone. The binder lay closed beside me. I didn't want to look at it again. I already knew what it would say. The fog returned just after full dark. There was no gradual creep this time, no warning at the horizon. One moment, the night was clear enough to see the stars reflected faintly on the water. The next, the lighthouse was wrapped in white so thick it felt solid, like the tower had been buried alive. I didn't log the time. I didn't have to check the buoys to know visibility was gone. The sound changed immediately, the world shrinking down to the tower and whatever stood just beyond it. I shut off the interior lights, leaving the stairwell glowing faintly, and braced myself. The footsteps didn't start right away. Instead, I heard something new. A low, dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving across the rocks at the base of the lighthouse. It reminded me of a heavy object being pulled over rough ground, pausing now and then as if to adjust its grip. Then came the voices. Not one, not many. A murmur of overlapping speech, too quiet to make out individual words, but unmistakably human in rhythm and cadence. They circled the tower, rising and falling, sometimes spiking into near clarity before dissolving again. "Help us. We're cold. You left the light on." I clamped my hands over my ears, teeth clenched. Rule 3. Do not respond. I repeated it to myself like a mantra, rocking slightly as the voices pressed closer. Testing. A knock sounded at the door. Gentle, polite. I felt my stomach drop. If it knocks, you're already too late. I stayed frozen, every muscle locked, waiting for the foghorn to sound on its own. Didn't. The knock came again, a little firmer this time. "Thomas!" A voice called, clear and close. "You did this." I shook my head, eyes squeezed shut. "Not listening," I whispered, though I knew better than to speak. The voice laughed softly, the sound sliding under the door like smoke. "You chose," it said. "Now we choose too." Something heavy struck the door, not enough to break it, but enough to make the wood shudder in its frame. Dust drifted down from the stone above. I scrambled backward, heart hammering, until my back hit the wall. The old phone rang. I stared at it in horror as it vibrated against its mount, the sound slicing through the air. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to hear what it had to say. But the ringing didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was drilling into my skull. I picked it up. This time there was no breathing, no layered voices, just silence. Then, very quietly, "Time," a voice said. The word echoed, stretching unnaturally, as if it were being spoken from a great distance. The binder slid across the desk again, opening on its own to the same page as before. "When the fog demands again, you must offer what remains. Choose differently." My chest tightened. Memory was already gone, pieces of it at least, and I knew instinctively that trying to offer it again would end badly. That left two options: time, self. The door shuddered under another impact, stronger than before. I heard with splintering, the slow, patient destruction of something that knew it would eventually get what it wanted. The voices outside grew louder, angrier, no longer bothering to pretend. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was analog, old-fashioned, the second hand ticking steadily forward. Time suddenly felt very real, very finite. "I choose time," I said hoarsely into the phone. The clock stopped, not slowed, not hesitated. It stopped completely, the second hand frozen mid-tick. The sensation that followed was worse than the first offering. It felt like falling without moving, like my body and mind were being peeled out of the present moment. The lighthouse groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through my chest. Outside, the fog reacted violently, roiling and churning as if stirred by a storm. The pounding at the door ceased abruptly. Light flared again, blinding white, and the world fractured. I saw myself standing in the tower, older, thinner, eyes hollow. I saw myself younger, stepping onto the boat for the first time, unaware. I saw moments that hadn't happened yet, or maybe never would, all layered on top of each other, impossible to separate. Time spilled out of me like water from a broken vessel. The figures in the fog screamed as it touched them, their forms stretching and collapsing, some dissolving entirely as if they couldn't exist without it. The thing with my face appeared briefly in the beam, its expression twisted in fury. "You don't get to keep that," it snarled. The fog recoiled, pulling back hard, as if burned. The door went still. The voices cut off mid-cry. When the light dimmed, I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The clock on the wall was gone. Not broken, gone. In its place was a blank circle of cleaner stone, as if it had never been mounted there at all. I checked my watch with trembling hands. The screen was dark. I had no idea how long I lay there, shaking, listening to the lighthouse hum as the light resumed its rotation on its own. Without time, moments blurred together, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Eventually, the fog thinned, then vanished, leaving behind a night that felt wrong in a different way. The sea was calm again, too calm. I knew then that I had made a mistake. The fog hadn't taken my time. It had taken my future, and there was still one price left to pay. Without time, night became meaningless. I couldn't tell how long I sat there after the fog retreated, staring at the blank circle on the wall where the clock had been. My body still knew exhaustion. My eyes burned. My muscles ached. But those sensations floated loose, unanchored, like they belonged to someone else. I tested small things first. I counted my breaths, lost track after 10. I tried to mark intervals by the rotation of the light, but even that felt unreliable now, like it was skipping, looping, stretching moments thin and snapping them back together. The lighthouse was still running, still doing its job, but I no longer trusted my place within it. That was when I realized the fog hadn't really left. I could see the sea clearly again, the rocks sharp and dark against the water, but something clung to the tower itself. A thin veil pressed close to the stone. It didn't move like fog, pulsed subtly, as if breathing. The binder was open on the desk. I hadn't touched it. The page was blank except for a single line, written larger than the others, the ink pressed deep and deliberate. Only one remains. My mouth went dry. Self. That was all that was left. Whatever that meant in this place, it wasn't going to be abstract. The earlier offerings had hurt in ways I was still struggling to understand, but this felt final. The radio crackled softly behind me. I turned slowly. It wasn't broadcasting static this time. It was quiet, expectant, like an open channel waiting to be used. I took a step back as the speaker clicked. Then a voice came through, clear and calm. "Thomas Reed," it said, "Keeper of the Light." Hearing my full name made something twist in my chest. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "You know who we are," the voice replied. "We are what gathers when the shore forgets. We are what remains when names are lost." Images flickered at the edges of my vision. Old ships, broken hulls half buried in rock. Figures waving desperately from places no one ever reached in time. The fog wasn't just a presence. It was an accumulation. "What do you want?" I asked. "To finish the exchange," the voice said. "You have taken more than you were meant to. You stopped the light. You showed us what should never have been shown. Balance must be restored." The thing with my face appeared outside again, standing closer than before, no longer hesitant. The thin veil around the tower thickened, seeping through cracks, coiling along the floor like smoke. It stepped forward until the light caught it fully. Up close, the resemblance was worse. Every line, every scar, every familiar imperfection was there, mirrored and distorted. It smiled without warmth. "You don't need all of you to keep the light," it said. "Just enough." The foghorn sounded once, sharp and abrupt. Not on its own this time, but in response, like a signal. The lighthouse trembled, the machinery straining. I felt it then, a pressure inside my chest, like something was being measured, weighed. The binder's pages fluttered wildly, stopping on a final entry that hadn't been there before. "To offer the self is to divide it. What remains will serve. What is taken will stay." "Stay where?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "With us," the thing said. "In the fog." The implications crashed down on me all at once. This wasn't about dying. This was about being split, about leaving part of myself behind as payment, bound to this place, this process, forever. "No," I said, backing away. "I won't do it." The fog surged forward in response, flooding the base of the tower, climbing the stairs with frightening speed. The voices returned, no longer pleading, no longer pretending to be human. They chanted in low, rhythmic unison, a sound that vibrated through my skull. "Choose, choose, choose." The light flickered, stuttering as if unsure whether to continue. I grabbed the railing to keep my balance as the tower shook. If the light failed now, I knew instinctively there would be nothing left to negotiate with. I thought of the rules again, not just the written ones, but the unspoken pattern beneath them. The lighthouse didn't protect the shore. It managed the fog, fed it, controlled it, kept it from spilling farther inland. And the keeper was part of that system. "I'll choose," I said, my voice shaking. "But I choose how?" The thing frowned, a flash of irritation crossing its borrowed features. "You don't get to." I cut the rotation again. The beam froze, locked directly on the doppelganger, illuminating it fully. It screamed, the sound ripping through the tower, as its form began to destabilize, edges blurring, features sliding out of alignment. "I choose myself," I said. "What's left of me?" I stepped into the light. The world tore open. Pain exploded through me, sharper and deeper than anything before, as if I were being pulled in opposite directions at once. I felt memories strain, stretch, snap. I felt something peel away from my thoughts, my instincts, my sense of who I was. The fog howled in fury. When it was over, I collapsed to the floor, gasping, my vision swimming. The beam resumed its rotation automatically, the lighthouse groaning as it settled back into place. Outside, the fog retreated violently, yanked back toward the sea as if dragged by an unseen hand. The voices cut off mid-chant, leaving behind a ringing silence. The thing with my face was gone. I lay there for a long time, shaking, waiting to feel something else taken from me. Eventually, I realized I could still think, still move, still remember my name. But when I searched inside myself, there was a hollow space where something essential used to be. Part of me was missing, cleanly removed. And I knew, without needing to be told, that it hadn't disappeared. It was still out there, keeping the fog company. Morning came without warning. One moment the world beyond the windows was black. The next it was washed in a thin, colorless light that felt more like an absence of night than the presence of day. I was still on the floor where I'd fallen, my body stiff and aching, my head buzzing with a low, persistent hum. The fog was gone, not thinned, not retreating, gone in a way that felt deliberate, like a door closing softly after someone leaves a room. The sea stretched out calm and empty, the rocks bare and sharp. No footprints, no shapes, no movement beyond the steady rotation of the lighthouse beam. Everything looked normal. That terrified me more than the fog ever had. I pushed myself upright slowly, half expecting the world to tilt or tear as I moved. It didn't. The tower felt stable again, solid beneath my feet. The machinery hummed at its usual pitch. The light rotated smoothly, completing full, uninterrupted sweeps. I realized then that I could tell it was morning. I didn't know how long the night had lasted, but I knew it was over. The certainty settled in my chest without explanation. Time, or at least my sense of it, had returned in some altered form, stitched back together wrong but functional. The blank circle on the wall where the clock had been was still there. I stared at it for a long time, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. The binder lay closed on the desk. When I picked it up, my hands didn't shake. That should have bothered me. I opened it carefully, bracing myself for new rules, new ink forming as I watched. There were no new entries. The last page was blank. No warnings, no instructions, just empty paper, as if the binder had finally said everything it was ever going to say. I flipped back through it, scanning the earlier rules, the margin notes, the warnings that had once felt so urgent. They felt distant now, not less important, just finalized. I went through the rest of the tower in silence, checking doors, panels, the radio, the phone. Everything was exactly where it should be. The inside of the base door still bore the carved tallies, but they were faded now, smoothed over as if by years of weathering rather than a single night. I counted them. There were fewer. I stopped when I realized I couldn't remember how many there had been before. Outside, the air smelled clean. Salt and stone and nothing else. I stepped out onto the catwalk and let the wind hit my face, sharp and real. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe it was over. Then I noticed the sound. The foghorn. It wasn't sounding. It was waiting. There was a pressure in the air around it, a coiled readiness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I could feel it in the same way I felt the hollow inside myself, a presence defined by its restraint. I leaned on the railing, staring out at the water, and that's when I saw the boat. A small Coast Guard vessel approached from the mainland, cutting a clean line through the sea. Relief surged through me so suddenly it almost knocked me over. I hadn't realized how desperately I'd needed to see another human until that moment. The boat slowed near the rocks, careful and precise. Two figures stood on deck, looking up at the lighthouse. One of them raised a hand and waved. I didn't wave back. Rule 3 echoed faintly in my mind, reflexive now, even in daylight. Do not respond. I didn't know if it still applied, but I wasn't ready to test it. They docked anyway. I heard their footsteps on the rocks, solid and human, nothing like the wrong sounds of the fog. A knock came at the base of the tower, firm and professional. Lighthouse keeper, a voice called. Coast Guard, routine check-in. I waited, heart pounding, listening for the foghorn to sound on its own. Didn't. I opened the door. The men looked normal, tired, sunburned, real. One of them checked his clipboard while the other glanced around the interior of the tower. You okay? The first one asked, eyes flicking briefly to my face, then away. We lost contact for a bit last night. I'm fine, I said automatically. The second man frowned slightly. You sure? You look different. I forced a smile. Long night. He nodded, accepting the answer without pressing. Fog roll through. I hesitated. Yes, I said finally. Felt important to say it out loud. They exchanged a look I couldn't read. The man with the clipboard made a note, then handed me a form to sign. As I took the pen, I noticed my hand didn't feel quite right, like it belonged to someone else. "You'll be relieved at the end of your rotation," he said. "Transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning." Tomorrow. The word landed strangely, heavy with implication. I nodded anyway. After they left, the tower felt emptier than it ever had before. I returned to the desk and stared at the binder one last time. On the very last page, in faint, nearly invisible ink, a single sentence had appeared. "What is taken does not always stay gone." I closed the binder and set it aside. Outside, far out on the water, I thought I saw a thin line of white forming at the horizon. Not fog, not yet. I didn't sleep that night either. Even with the fog gone, even with the promise of relief in the morning, rest felt dangerous, like letting go of the last thing I still fully controlled. I sat at the desk, watching the lighthouse beam sweep its slow arc across the dark water, counting rotations out of habit even though the numbers slipped away almost as soon as I formed them. The hollow inside me made itself known in quiet ways. Not pain, not fear, absence. Like a room in a house you've lived in your whole life that's suddenly sealed shut. The outline's still there, but the door gone. I could feel it when I breathed too deeply, when my thoughts drifted too close to certain memories and slid off them instead. Whatever I'd left in the fog hadn't been random. It had been specific. Near dawn, the foghorn sounded. Just once. Long and low. I was on my feet instantly, heart hammering, scanning the windows. The sea was still clear. No white wall rushing in. No shapes gathering at the rocks. The sound hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside the tower. The control panel glowed softly, untouched, the horn indicator dark. The sound faded, leaving behind a vibration that lingered in my teeth. I stood there shaking, realizing something fundamental had changed. The rules weren't over. They were finished with me. The sky lightened slowly, pale gray giving way to washed-out blue. When the boat returned, right on schedule, I was already packed. There wasn't much to take. A duffel bag, a few clothes. The rest felt like it belonged to the lighthouse now. As I stepped onto the deck of the boat, I looked back at the tower one last time. The light continued its steady rotation, indifferent, eternal. For a moment, I thought I saw movement behind the glass at the top. A shape standing where I'd stood so many times before. Then the angle shifted and it was gone. Neither of the Coast Guard men spoke during the ride back. The engine hummed, the mainland growing larger with each passing minute. I focused on the sound of the water cutting cleanly against the hull, grounding myself in something undeniably real. When we reached the dock, paperwork was brief. Too brief. No questions. No incident report. Just signatures and clipped professionalism. The supervisor from my first day was there, older somehow than I remembered, his eyes tired. "You did your duty," he said quietly as he handed me my final form. "Most don't." I wanted to ask him how many keepers there had been before me. I wanted to ask what happened to the parts they left behind. I didn't. Some answers don't belong to the people who survive. I left the coast that afternoon. Days passed. Then weeks. Life resumed in the shallow, tentative way it does after something breaks you without leaving visible scars. I found a new job inland, far from the sea. I slept, eventually. I laughed, sometimes. From the outside, I looked fine. Inside, something stayed quiet. Too quiet. I stopped dreaming about the ocean. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like another loss layered on top of the first. When I tried to picture the lighthouse, details blurred. I knew it existed. I knew what had happened there. But the emotional weight slid off the memories like water off stone. Until the fog started appearing in other places. Not real fog. Not at first. Condensation on my bathroom mirror that formed fingerprints I didn't remember making. Breath in cold air that lingered a second too long after I exhaled. Voices just below the threshold of hearing when I walked alone at night, not calling my name, just acknowledging my presence. The first time I smelled salt in my apartment, I froze. It was faint, almost imaginary, but it carried that same metallic edge, the scent of wet coins and old stone. I followed it instinctively, heart pounding, until I stood in front of my bedroom closet. The door was slightly open. I knew, with the same bone-deep certainty I'd felt in the lighthouse, that something was waiting on the other side. I didn't open it. I backed away slowly, left the apartment, and didn't return until morning. The smell was gone by then. The closet was empty. No marks. No sign of disturbance. I told myself it was stress. I told myself a lot of things. Months later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. A lighthouse, not the one I'd worked in. A different coast, a different tower. But the fog around it was familiar, coiling low and thick, pressing close like it was listening. On the back of the photo, written in cramped, familiar handwriting, were the words, "Rotation begins at dusk." I understood then what I'd really agreed to. The fog doesn't belong to one place. It moves. It accumulates. And it needs people like me, people who know the rules, who've already paid the price to keep it contained. What I left behind in the fog wasn't gone. It was working. Sometimes, late at night, I feel it watching through my eyes, checking the horizon, measuring the light. Sometimes my hands twitch like they remember controls I haven't touched in months. Sometimes I wake up standing, heart racing, convinced I hear waves crashing against stone that isn't there. I don't fight it anymore. I follow the rules I still remember, because I know how this ends for people who don't. And when the fog finally comes for me again, wherever I am, I won't pretend it's a coincidence. I was a lighthouse keeper,